We're going to turn now to a discussion of the General Prologue of the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. The source for this presentation will be Helen Cooper, and complete bibliographic information for her work is provided on the Works Cited page for the second unit of our course. Okay, let's begin with an introduction to the General Prologue. Now, Geoffrey Chaucer is believed by scholars to have been about 40 years old when he began writing the Canterbury Tales, and it's believed that he wrote them beginning in 1387 and continued working on them until his death in 1400. It is unfortunately an unfinished work, and 15 different manuscripts in Chaucer's hand have been found. And one of the things the scholars aren't certain of is what order the tales were to have appeared in. Now, as we see even from reading the closing of the General Prologue, there are links in some of the prologues and the ends of some pilgrims' tales that indicate that certain groups of tales needed to be presented in a certain order. And those groups are called fragments. So scholars are fairly sure about the order of the stories within each fragment, but we don't really know in most cases what order the fragments go in. However, it is believed that the General Prologue was written fairly early in Chaucer's composing process. Now, the Canterbury Tales is a story collection, and story collections were very popular at this period of in medieval Europe. Most story collections do open with some type of a prologue, like Chaucer's General Prologue. What most prologues do for these other tales, for these other groups of tales, and the most famous is probably Boccaccio's Decameron, other than the Canterbury Tales, which actually is the most famous and the most widely read, and was at the time. But what the prologues to other tales do is they set up the circumstances for the various characters who are going to tell the tales to come together. Something that's important to keep in mind, and Cooper doesn't say this, but it is an important aspect of these story collections, including, it might even be argued, particularly the Canterbury Tales. In these story collections, the tales were told by characters who are brought together under some circumstance that requires them to spend some time together without really having any purpose or goal in mind. For example, in the Decameron by Boccaccio, as we know, the medieval period in Europe was the period of the plague, or the Black Death. And the plague was so highly contagious that when the plague reared its nasty head in a city, people who had any money at all would often escape cities and go to rural areas, because that way they could escape the contagion and possibly escape dying from the plague, which was a particularly nasty way to die. So in the Decameron, we had this group of relatively affluent, wealthy people who gather together on an estate, and they have to stay there for a considerable amount of time until the plague disappears from surrounding towns. And so they tell each other stories. And here, of course, we have people from various areas of England who meet at this inn called the Tabard Inn, and then they set out together on a pilgrimage to Canterbury. Now, it's very important that these people are not in the communities in which they live, because our pilgrims are very open and honest about who they are and what they want. They are very honest about themselves in the prologues to their tales, and their tales are very telling about their individual personalities. Now, it's kind of like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Unless, of course, you live here. That doesn't apply to us. But the idea is that when we're not around people that know us, we can be more honest because we don't rely on their opinion of us in order to carry out our lives. It is easier sometimes to be truthful with strangers than it is with those who are closest to us. And we're definitely going to see this when we discuss both the wife of Bath and the partner. The wife of Bath is not going to talk about how she tricks men into marrying her and what she thinks is important in marriage. When she's among men she might actually marry, because nobody would want to marry this woman if they knew the truth about her, at least not in medieval England. But with people that don't know her, that she is not trying to make an impression on in order to achieve a social status in her community, she can be very honest about her beliefs and her approach. The same of all the pilgrims. So the fact that they're on a pilgrimage and they're away from their communities allows them to be honest and to tell the tales they tell. So this traveling away from their homes is absolutely necessary in order for the Canterbury Tales to even take place within even a fictional realm. So this traveling outside of the home is very, very important. Chaucer's General Prologue is very different from the prologues to the other story collections, because the other story collections are shorter and they pretty much focus on setting up the circumstances. That's what the entire prologue does. That's not what the General Prologue to the Canterbury Tales does. Yes, it does at the very end, as we saw when we read it, it does set up the whole Tales contest. But before we get to that portion, there's the very, very, very lengthy section of the General Prologue that introduces us to the actual pilgrims and begins to let us know them. As Cooper points out, the General Prologue is actually built on a completely separate genre called estates satire. Now, it's important to understand what estates meant in medieval England as opposed to what it means now. When we use the word estates now, we generally refer to either a massive, luxurious home with large grounds, or we're referring to the material goods that a person leaves behind when they die. But that's not what estates meant in medieval England. What it meant, it's more like states of man in terms of their social hierarchy. And estate satire is a satirical attempt, according to Cooper, it's a satirical attempt to analyze society in terms of social hierarchy, social function, and morality. Cooper says that in general, estate satire examines social classes or professions with the goal of showing how far the people in those professions actually fall short of the ideal. Now, according to Cooper, the simplest division of medieval society put men in 3 different estates, 3 different classifications of professions or vocations, if you will. And Chaucer has representatives of each of them. The 3 estates of men were men who fight, men who pray, and men who work. Men who fight clearly are members of the military and possibly even to some degree nobility. But we have to keep in mind that the nobles and the royals had their own hierarchy. Kings, lords, earls, dukes, and so forth. Up until the growth of specialization in work, other people didn't have a hierarchy. There were the royals and there were the serfs, and that was about it, as we know if we've studied anything about early Europe. But as people were beginning to become more skilled, at very, very specific types of jobs, such as masonry, for example. There began to be a hierarchy among people other than royalty. So we have the men who fight, which at this point were largely knights, squires, and other people on the battlefield. The men who pray, who of course were men generally associated with the church. Both the priests and the members of the Catholic Church, cleric, from the Pope down to the lowliest parson. And it also includes laymen, in other words, working class men who weren't sworn into the priesthoods, who performed certain specialized function for the church. And then finally we have men who work. And men who work would include the very, very skilled laborers, such as the masons or the weavers or the tapestry makers and so forth. And also men who did just manual labor. Now, Chaucer does include an ideal man, an ideal pilgrim for each of these estates. The ideal man who fights in the Canterbury Tales is the knight. The ideal among the men who pray in the Canterbury Tales is the parson. And the ideal among the men who work in the Canterbury Tales is the plowman. All of the other pilgrims fall into these estates, but they are less than the ideal for various reasons. Women, of course, were treated completely separately, if they were dealt with at all. Women didn't fall into any of the estates of men, and as we know from reading The Wife of Bath's Tale, men had no idea what actually was going on with women or what they wanted, so they generally weren't included at all in these story collections, and if they were, they certainly weren't considered a member of any of the estates of men. But as Cooper points out, the General Prologue is different from most estate satires. For one thing, as Cooper says, the pilgrims in the General Prologue and throughout the Canterbury Tales are definitely individual human beings. They're not stereotypes of a profession, even though we seldom learn their actual names. The Wife of Bath is a unique character. She is not a stereotype of what all wives in medieval England were like, and she's not presented as a stereotype. She is presented as having a very distinct personality. In fact, one of the most colorful and outstanding personalities in all of English literature. The partner has his own personality, and this is true of all the pilgrims. They're definitely individuals, not stereotypes. And another way that Chaucer's General Prologue differs from most estate satires is that he doesn't conform to the general model of satire at the time, which was to be openly vindictive and openly critical of whatever was being critiqued. Chaucer never says anything bad about any of the pilgrims. If we go through and read the General Prologue, we see that he says about most of them that they are the best of their kind. Now, he does hedge that a little bit. In describing many of the pilgrims, he uses words like appears or seems. For example, he will say that one of them seems to constantly be busy. But seeming to be busy and actually being busy, it's not necessarily the same thing. And so Chaucer implies that what this person appears to be on the surface and what the pilgrim actually is are not the same thing, which casts a lot of doubt on whether they actually are representative or the best or the worst of their type. Regardless, we're left with the question, given that so many of the pilgrims are not particularly 100% ethical, sinless, ideal types, we're left with the question of This guy is the best of their type? What are the rest of them like? Okay, let's turn now to the prologue itself by talking about the opening lines. Now, that 18-line opening sentence sets up a model that the tales themselves follow. In this first sentence, what appears to be a really straightforward approach to saying that people like to go on pilgrimages in the spring, according to Cooper, actually covers layers and layers of irony. Cooper points out that in general, the movement in this 18-line opening sentence is from winter to spring, from sickness to health, from death to life. Now, as Cooper tells us, that's also the general movement of secular romantic literature. And of course, it's also the movement of the salvation story of Christianity, is from death to life. Jesus is resurrected, and we are promised that if we are Christians and we follow the teachings of Jesus, that we will be resurrected from death into eternal life. So what we see is that since the movement of this opening line reflects the movement of both secular romantic literature and the movement of the salvation story of Christianity, it sets up a pattern of, according to Cooper, both tension and similarity between secular and religious attitudes. And those differences and similarities continue to be evident throughout all of the tales in the Canterbury Tales. Now, Cooper says that one way that the General Prologue accomplishes this pairing is by describing the natural regeneration that is attributed to God and that takes place in the spring. Well, Chaucer actually describes those in sexual terms. Now, the translation that Norton gives us is not the best translation for demonstrating that pairing in Chaucer's poem. It moves away from some of the original wording that establishes the sexual nature of what's going on. But just to give you an example, in the original, it states where it talks about the buds and shoots being bathed in nurturing rain. In the original poem, it says that the plants are bathed through every vein of sap in the spring with rain. Okay, now, vein of sap refers to an expression about men that says that the sap is rising in him. Now, what we mean by that is that a young man is beginning to feel sexually potent and is, well, horny. So by referring to sap rising and the sap within the plants, there is a sexual connotation there, as Cooper points out. Cooper also points out that in the section where it's talking about how birds sleep with their eyes open because they feel so alive, in the original it says that life tingles in them so. Well, tingle always has a kind of a sexual connotation for fairly obvious reasons that we're not going to discuss. So, the natural regeneration of spring that is a gift from God is described by Chaucer in this sentence in sexual terms. So again, we see the pairing of the spiritual with the sexual or physical, which we also see in the tales themselves. It's also important to note that setting the tales in the spring is really significant because spring is the time of rebirth and regeneration. And that is seen in Christianity as a gift from God. And it also, of course, as Cooper points out, reflects the resurrection of Jesus Christ because it's life coming from death. But spring is also a time of heightened sexual feeling. And in areas of the country like Las Vegas where we don't actually have a winter, that's, I think, much less noticeable. But in areas like England, and I'm going to switch this into modern day because, frankly, it's something I know, okay? If you live someplace that has true winter with snow and freezing cold weather, the movement to spring is much, much more exciting than it is here. That's okay because, frankly, if I never see another snowflake, as long as I live, I'll be happy. But in areas that have true winter, people are more or less trapped in their houses, even in modern day. It's not that we don't get out or can't get out, it's just miserable getting out. It is so cold that you have to put on 4 or 5 layers of clothing just to go to the mailbox. Driving is very hazardous because of the snow and the ice. It snows all the time. It tends to be very, very gray. And when it isn't gray, when the sun is shining, the temperatures seldom get above 10 degrees. It's a miserable period. You can't open windows, so you feel very shut in. So when spring comes along, and finally you can stop wearing all those extra clothes, and you can open your windows, and you can go to the park, and you can be out among people, there is definitely an excitement to that. And in modern days, I know where I come from, a traditional spring event was that guys would start taking their cars and motorcycles and so forth to certain parking areas in a park in our town called Bradley Park. And they would just park there and be there because the girls who had been hiding underneath all those clothes were now walking around in very short shorts or even lying out in the sun in bikinis. Okay? So the decrease of clothing is sexual. And there's just something in the air that is exciting and that just matches the kind of sexuality that we see in spring in the animal kingdom when so many animals breed. So while spring is a time of regeneration and life from death, which of course reminds us of the promise of Christianity, it's also highly sexual. So we have an inherent irony of spring in and of itself, and placing the pilgrimage in spring and discussing the fact that people like to go on pilgrimages in the spring helps to set up this pattern of tension and similarity between the spiritual and the physical that we see throughout the tales. Finally, it's very important to note that, as Cooper points out, Chaucer doesn't divide the concepts of regeneration that's applied by God from sexuality. And he doesn't label one as being good and the other as being sin. In fact, by including all of this information in this one very packed sentence, as Cooper said, he demonstrates that love and penitence, fallibility and seeking perfection, the order of nature and the order of the spirit cannot be so easily untangled as people tried to do. Actions, attitudes, feelings cannot be as easily labeled and judged as this is a good moral Christian thing to do and this is a sin. It's not as clear cut as that. And we definitely see that in our pilgrims and in the tales that they tell. Okay, let's talk about the introduction of the wife of Bath in the General Prologue. First of all, as Cooper points out, the wife of Bath is considered by many to be Chaucer's best creation, and possibly one of the very best women characters in all of literature. And even in the General Prologue, Chaucer hints at what an extraordinary character the wife of Bath is. The first thing he tells us is that she's a professional weaver, and that not only is she a professional weaver, but she's as good as the men in the towns that were really, really known for weaving. There was a time when Detroit was basically the automotive capital of the world. And the people who were in Detroit and built cars, that's what Detroit was known for, was automotive production. It's similar with these cities that Chaucer mentions. They're known for weaving, and she's as good as any of them are. And as Cooper points out, that's important because weaving was one of the few professions that women were believed to be capable of holding. Women's capabilities were highly devalued, which continued to be true into the 1970s. Women were simply thought to be inferior and incapable of doing the things that men could do. But in medieval England, they were considered capable of being weavers. So by making her an outstanding weaver, as Cooper points out, he's actually setting her ahead of other women in society. Now, the next thing we learn about the wife of Bath is that she insists on being first in line for the offering in church. That may seem really insignificant, but as Cooper points out, at this point, outside of large cities like London, church was often the social center in many, many towns. So, how a person ranks in the congregation both influences and demonstrates what their standing is in the social hierarchy in their town. How close to the front your family's assigned pew was. Who went first in line for things such as offerings and confessions demonstrated and influenced your social standing in your community, according to Cooper. Obviously, the offering represents a show of both economic affluence and Christian love, as Cooper points out. And so the wife of Bath insists on being seen as first in both of these, which means she wants to be seen as the best when it counts the most. After that, of course, Chaucer gives us a lot of detail about how the wife of Bath dresses for church when she's at home. And Cooper says that her conspicuous overdressing demonstrates to the people in her community that she is a prosperous businesswoman. And also what Chaucer is telling us about her, according to Cooper, is that she's a social climber. Many, if not most, of the Pilgrims are portrayed as social climbers, because being a social climber was a relatively new concept, thanks to the growing middle class that we've already discussed. It used to be a serf was a serf was a serf, but now holding certain professions and being respected in those professions gave you a standing in the community that didn't exist before this specialization of work and the growth of the professions. But Cooper reminds us that in spite of her success as a weaver and her standing in her community and the importance of those things, the wife's vocation is that of being a wife. And as Cooper says, she's as dedicated to it and pursues it as actively as the knight does chivalry or the parson does religion. She is a wife first and foremost. We learn that she's had 5 husbands, and she's looking for a 6th if she can find him. And her prologue, of course, defends this idea of multiple marriages. Now, Cooper points out that marrying promptly after husbands' deaths was very common in medieval England because women were not actually allowed to legally own anything. Everything belonged to a woman's father before she was married and her husband afterward. If a woman is left a widow, this left her very vulnerable, according to Cooper, to have relatives of either hers or her deceased husband's swoop in and literally take everything away from her. Her home, in the wife of Bass case, her business, all of her possessions, even her children, because women were not allowed to own anything. So in order to attain any kind of legal status at all, a woman had to be associated with a man. So remarrying after a woman is widowed was not all that uncommon, just as it's not today. But Chaucer makes it clear, even in the General Prologue, that the wife's main interest in being married is sexual as well as anything having to do with finances. One of the ways we know this is because it talks about how many pilgrimages she's been on and how widely traveled she is. Of all the pilgrims introduced in the General Prologue, only the knight is more widely traveled, and of course he's traveled a lot to participate in battles. The wife has been on a lot of pilgrimages, not only in England, but also in other areas of Europe. And pilgrimages, when women went on pilgrimages, it was thought that they did so to hide or cover some kind of a sexual liaison or affair. Actually, nuns were out and out forbidden to go on pilgrimages because of the sexual nature of them. Although, of course, as we see in Chaucer, many nuns did go on pilgrimages, despite the fact that the church forbade them. Okay, let's talk about the partner for a while. Now, if we study and discuss all of the pilgrims that are presented in the General Prologue, we see that except for the parson, each pilgrim associated with the church, and at that time it would have been the Catholic Church, is more sinful than the one before. The partner and the sumner are the two really grossest representatives of the church, and they're two of the grossest pilgrimages in the Canterbury Tale. The partner is almost immediately identified as a Simonist, and Simonists were a type of sinner that Dante assigns to the eighth circle of hell. A Simonist is a person who makes money through religious fraud. And the first thing that Chaucer says about him is that he is from the Hospital of St. Mary's at Roncesvalles. Now, that hospital had tried twice to raise money by selling indulgences, and it had been the source of, or the subject of scandal because of this. Now, partners weren't priests. They were lay people that the church hired to distribute indulgences that came from the Pope. And I need to explain the whole theory behind indulgences because they don't exist anymore. According to Cooper, there were people who could not truly repent their sins. Because in order to repent a sin, you have to be sorry you committed it. And some people weren't sorry for every sin they committed. Some of them recognized that their actions may have been sinful, but they thought it was necessary under the circumstances, and they weren't really sorry they did it. Well, if you weren't sorry, you couldn't confess. And if you couldn't confess and do penance, then you would die with that sin on your soul. And people who die with sin on their soul cannot go to heaven. So what could be done about these people who realize that they've sinned and they don't want to die with a sin on their soul, but they're not really sorry for what they did? Well, according to Cooper, that's where indulgences came in. And the idea was that Jesus and the saints had stored up a great deal of virtue in heaven. Let's call it the virtue bank. Okay, Cooper doesn't call it that, but just for ease of discussion, let's call it the virtue bank. Okay, so if a person wasn't truly sorry for his or her sins, they could petition the Pope or the Church for an indulgence signed by the Pope. And an indulgence didn't forgive a sin, but it did cloak it. And it covered it by making a withdrawal from this bank of virtue that had been laid up by Jesus and the saints. And this virtue would then cover the sin that the person couldn't regret and therefore couldn't confess. So when the person died, they would be able to go to heaven. The sin isn't actually forgiven, but it's hidden and cloaked and covered by all this virtue that Jesus and the saints had laid up in heaven. I know, it's a weird concept, but, you know, it was a loophole in going to hell, I guess you might call it, that was available in the early church. Now, these indulgences were often provided along with an idea that the person receiving it would make a charitable donation to a Catholic hospital, a Catholic church, or some other Catholic charitable organization. Now you can see where this was really open for abuse. And as Cooper points out, that's exactly what our partner does. There's the implication, even in the General Prologue, that the indulgences that the partner has, they don't come from Rome. He signed them himself, which means that they carry no authority with the church, which means that they carry no authority with God, and aren't cloaking anything. And then, of course, the money that he collected that was supposed to be given to charitable organizations, he just pocketed himself. So, essentially, what he does is that he leads people to believe that sins they've committed are cloaked by an indulgence when really they aren't. And so they die and are eternally damned because they die with a sin on their soul. And so what some partners and what our partner does is basically send people to hell as a way of getting money. And it's hard to imagine anything that's worse than that. Now, after identifying the partner as a fraud, Chaucer turns to a physical description of him. Now, as Cooper points out, in medieval Europe, appearance and personality were thought to be dictated by 4 bodily fluids, which were called the 4 humors. And those 4 fluids were blood, phlegm, urine, and bile. And as Cooper reminds us, the theory was that your personality and how you looked were both determined based on how well these fluids were in balance and which one was dominant. And since both appearance and personality were determined by the balance or dominance of these fluids in the body, then appearance was a reflection or an indication of the personality. So when Chaucer gives us a physical description, he's also commenting about the personal nature of the pilgrim as well, as Cooper points out. Now, as Cooper says, the way that the partner is described in the General Prologue would have been seen as effeminate. And in medieval Europe, feminine traits in a man suggested sexual deviancy. Although we're not really sure, and scholars debate exactly what the nature of that deviance was. But definitely being effeminate was associated with sexual deviance in medieval Europe. In particular, though, we are given some indications of what the partner's deviance might be. For one thing, he's compared to a hare. And Cooper tells us that in medieval Europe, hares were believed to be hermaphroditic. In other words, they had the sex organs of both genders. He's also compared to a gelding, which of course is a horse that's been castrated. Now, Cooper says that the implication about the partner is that he is a congenital eunuch, meaning that he was born without testicles. And as Cooper says, his physical impotence is symbolic of his spiritual impotence. As she explains, if the partner is a congenital eunuch, then he has no true gender. He doesn't have female reproductive organs, and he doesn't have testicles, so he's not a reproductive male. He's not in any true gender. And just as he has no true gender, the spiritual implication, Cooper says, is that he also has no soul. And then finally, in the introduction to the partner that we have in the General Prologue, we reach a discussion of how he carries with him various pieces of, well, garbage that he would then claim were religious relics and sell those. And that's how he made most of his money. Now, as we're going to see when we study the partner would visit mainly rural parishes, and he would dupe uneducated but very devout country people out of what little money they had by, first of all, selling fake indulgences, which condemned them to hell as well as took their money, selling fake relics, and by his sermon. Now, partners were not supposed to preach because they weren't priests. And only priests were supposed to preach at that time in the Catholic Church. But most of them did anyway, and our partner certainly does. In fact, he, as we learn when we read the prologue to the partner's tale, the partner specifically designs his sermon to be about how evil greed is. And he gives this sermon before the offertory, which guilts people into putting more in the offering plate than they probably can actually afford to. So, by selling fake indulgences, selling fake relics, and preaching against greed, which led people to put more money in the offering than they could actually afford, the partner managed to make a pretty decent amount of money. And as Cooper pointed out, he converts everything about religion, from the offertory and charitable giving to the cloaking of sin through indulgences, into a fraudulent grab for cash, which he, of course, pockets. You know, it's really difficult to imagine any living thing that's worse than a person who would endanger eternal souls for money. But the partner does it. And as we learn in the General Prologue, he is so joyful at the success that he has doing this that he frequently sings both loudly and quite happily. And let's make a couple of points about the closing lines. While the closing lines of the General Prologue certainly don't demonstrate the layers of irony that we see in the opening lines, they are important because they establish at least two principles that carry through and dominate the tales. First, Chaucer establishes himself as a straightforward reporter of the tales that are told by the pilgrims. Okay? And by stating that he is relating each tale simply as an attempt to honestly and objectively report what the pilgrims say, he pretty much absolves himself of any guilt for relating tales that some people might find objectionable or unsavory, and there are some tales that definitely would offend some people, even now, for that matter. He sets up an idea that he's not to be blamed for the unsavory nature of some tales, and he tells readers, if you find one that's unsavory that you don't like, just move on, because there are also more highly moral tales, and you don't have to read that one if you don't like it. But I had to report it because that's just what I'm doing. I'm just telling you what they said. Okay? Now, what he does there is he sets up a distinction between Chaucer, who is traveling with the pilgrims and is a pilgrim among pilgrims, and Chaucer, the author, who's making the whole thing up to begin with. And as we're going to see when we talk about the Pardoner's Tale, what that does is it establishes another layer of fiction, because we have Chaucer the author, and then there's Chaucer the Pilgrim, and Chaucer the Pilgrim is telling the tales that are told by the pilgrims. Okay? So that's 3 layers of fiction we have right there. And then if we read all of the Canterbury Tales, we see that some of the tales that the pilgrims tell have stories within stories within stories, because other characters in their tales tell stories. And there are up to 7 layers of fiction in, for example, the Nun's Priest's Tale. And yet Chaucer handles all of these layers so adeptly that readers are able to follow it without getting confused at all. And that's one of the things, one of the many, many, many things that makes the Canterbury Tales such a beautiful piece of literature. And then finally, of course, we have Harry Bailey setting up the Tales contest. So here we see the framework for the tales themselves being established at the end of a lengthy prologue, when, as we talked about, the prologues to most other story collections focused only on setting up the circumstances of the tales. It's interesting to note that what Bailey proposes is that each pilgrim will tell one tale on the way to Canterbury and one on the return trip. Chaucer died, of course, before he could even finish the first set. It would have been really interesting to see if the pilgrims' experience at the shrine changed their attitudes and their beliefs, and if those changes were reflected in the tales they told coming back. It would be interesting to see if that was Chaucer's overall intent in writing the tales to begin with. But you know, we can never know. We can never know what this work might have become had Chaucer not died. And considering that it is one of the most respected and fantastic and hilarious pieces of literature in English as it is, we really have to wonder what it would have been like had the entire thing been written. Okay, that's what I wanted to share with you from Helen Cooper about the General Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. I hope this presentation pointed out some things that you hadn't noticed and helped you understand the General Prologue a little bit better. You know, of course, that if you have any questions, all you have to do is email me through Canvas. As a matter of fact, email me through Canvas about anything. Believe me, I would really love to talk to you about the Canterbury Tales, because I just love this piece of literature. I think it's fantastic. Until we talk again, have a really good day.